This is Chris Saxman with Virginia Free, welcoming Amanda Iovino. Is that correct pronunciation?
Yep,
Iovino?
got it.
Okay, great stuff. Who is with WPA Intel, a great polling modeling operation out of Washington, D.C. Herself a native of New York, now residing in the District of Columbia, man. And we're just obviously doing this via the good folks at Zoom and Facebook. We're live on Facebook now. So Amanda, why don't you take it away? Briefly describe your firm, what you do, your secret sauce, and then let's just launch right into the webinar that you put together, the slide deck, and then we'll jump into some of the questions.
Awesome. So, well, thanks for having me. First of all, excited to be here. I'm Amanda Iovino. I'm a senior client strategist over at WPA Intelligence. We are a polling and analytics firm. So we do kind of your typical polling, those annoying people that call you typically during dinner. And then the analytics is predictive analytics. It's judging the likelihood of people to support or oppose someone, something, an idea, whatever their predictive behavior is going to be. It's kind of the evolution of micro-targeting. We're able to help with campaigns, but also companies really target people on like an individual level and market.
Let's back up. You brought up an interesting topic there. You reach people mainly during dinner.
Not on purpose, but
no, that's when you get most people. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, typically that's when they're home. Although the last couple of months have been fantastic for actually reaching people because everyone's been home all the time.
Well, employers are able to get more productivity out of their employees too. So everyone's, I think we're seeing a revolution in productivity and connectivity, but it's very different these days. And I know a lot of what we're seeing online and on TV is I think changing a lot of opinions very quickly in this country because everyone's it's almost like it was back in the day before cable, before the internet, when everyone watched 3 channels and they had the same opinion of things. Now we're seeing very, very similar images all the time. So we're all sort of baked into the same reality rather than, going to work and getting caught in traffic and, wasting, apparently the average wasted time in traffic is almost 100 hours a year for the average American commuter. So now that's 100 more hours on average combined. People are more locked on screens like we are now. So I want to do this as a preface to get people engaged online. But let's jump into that slide deck you prepared for us, which I really appreciate. And I also appreciate your colors a little bit brighter than what's normally come across, because some of these, as a colorblind guy, I often have problems with color graphs and charts. So let's just jump into it.
All right. So jump in and thought we'd start with kind of where are we now, especially in Virginia. So unfortunately, there hasn't been a decent number of polls of the Commonwealth in the last couple of weeks, either private or public. So the most recent one that we have to look at is kind of the Roanoke College poll, which was in the beginning of May. So at that point in time, Virginians were mostly positive about the direction of the state. 57% of people said the state was going in the right direction. 37% were off on the wrong track. Now, we've been seeing elsewhere around the country that people have gotten more pessimistic over the last couple of weeks, and whether that is because of a resurgence in coronavirus in states that have started to open up, or it's because of the protests and kind of the inequalities that those have been highlighting, it's kind of up for debate. But I would expect that this number has changed in the last couple of weeks.
But I think that's due to the protests. I mean, I think people are taking a wrong track direction here very, very sharply on that. That's just me. Go ahead.
No, I agree. I think that's probably the bulk of it.
Right.
And I think most people, from what I've seen in other, let's call it the suburban areas where we're always focused on, is that they are pro protests. They're pro the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay. But there is going to be a concern with the defund the police movement. That kind of gets into people, and especially suburban women's individual sense of safety. So we'll see kind of how that plays out over the next couple of months.
Okay, that's something to look forward to. Is that something you're going to be polling and modeling on?
I'm sure we will. Especially, like I said, in those suburban districts that are always the battlegrounds, suburban areas for statewide races.
Okay.
It's going to be a thing.
Okay, very good.
So looking at the governor's approval rating back in November, in the middle of the contested election, he was still right side up on approval, 35% approved, 28% disapprove. In February, kind of during session, as he was pushing through a lot of controversial bills, his approval rating kind of was split 40% approved, 41% disapprove. But in May, he got a bit of a bump. We saw it, frankly, among a lot of governors all across the country, and Trump to a certain extent as well. He was at 59% approval, 29% disapproval. So here on the next slide, we can look at kind of how he compares to other governors in the region and other states that were hard hit. So this is a different survey. This is done by Survey USA and Washington Post.
Okay.
So this kind of puts all of them on an even playing field, right? We're looking at the same set of numbers, the same methodology across all of these states. So here, Northam had a 67% approval rating. Compare that to Maryland, Governor Hogan is an 85% approval rating. Now, he has consistently been one of the best performing governors on job approval.
Why is it? Let's do a little dive here on Hogan. Why is he so popular? What's he doing? Republican governor in a Democratic state.
You know, I think he has been out there. He's been in the community. He's been making outreach to communities that typically Republicans haven't made a lot of outreach to, especially in Baltimore. I remember one of his ads from his first term when he was looking for re-election. He had this African-American man, I think his name was Squeaky, actually do an ad for him. And the Squeaky said that when Hogan was running the first time, he came over to his charity and said, you know, win or lose, I'm going to be back here for you, helping you out in whatever capacity I can. And then the guy was very surprised that, you know, Hogan won, and then he actually showed up to help. And it was, I believe it was without cameras. It could be wrong on that, but you know, he actually did follow through on some of his promises, and specifically promises to the African American community, and that kind of has held him through, you know, a lot of crises that have happened in Baltimore specifically and throughout the state.
But he did what he said he was going to do. That strikes to the integrity issue. It also strikes to the fact that he's willing to, you know, get outside of his lane, his comfort zone with Republicans, just talking to Republicans, which I think is the problem. One of the problems in our country writ large is that Democrats only talk to Democrats, and Republicans only talk to Republicans, because we're in this binary reality show at best, political disaster of a country that we're turning into, because we don't talk to each other. We don't talk to our silos. But that's my little editorial. Go ahead, Amanda.
No,
and I'm going to be doing that a lot, by the way, because I'm sick and tired of it. You know?
So Northam is on kind of the lower end of this bounce that we kind of see across these states. The only one that's lower kind of in the region is Tennessee Governor Lee. Cooper is a little bit higher. New Jersey, Murphy, Cuomo definitely got a lot of a media bump in the early stages of the crisis, and then out in California, Newsom also did as well. And I think Northam's being on the lower end stems more from how low his approval was before the crisis. So he was starting at a lower point statewide than a lot of these other governors did.
Okay.
So now kind of switching over to what everyone is probably going to be focused on is this, the presidential race. So again, in May, and these numbers change daily, if not weekly, much less monthly, Virginia is 51% Biden, 39% Trump, and then about 3% undecided. So I think they forced everybody into a choice here. And it's important to remember that Clinton did not reach 50% in the state in 2016. So this is definitely a shift to the left in Virginia. Where does Virginia kind of land among other typical swing states or atypical swing states? Definitely more.
Let me back you up on that. I'm just going to challenge, because Roanoke College hasn't necessarily had the most accurate polling in the world, but I think obviously Biden has a lead in Virginia. I'm not going to dispute that. Whether it's 12 or 8, anyone's guess.
Yeah.
So do you think the move has been to the left or away from Trump? I mean, that's been the trend here in Virginia, is just, you know, anything but Trump. But you're talking a relative scale here to the other states. So
talking relative scale to the other states, but I think it's hard to really tell, because this is the Roanoke College poll, and it's really the only poll that we've had since May. I don't have enough data to really tell you if it's Trump specific or if it's to the left. I mean, we can look back. And you and I have talked after the 2019 election that the state did move to the left, and how much of that was the president and Democrats' ability to tie local candidates to the national party. How much of that was the effect, or was it some more specific state concerns, like gun control played a big part in the 2019 elections.
Right.
So it's
but
probably,
what we are seeing though, obviously, is the shift that's occurring in this country is fascinating to watch. Just on this list alone, you look where Virginia is relative to Colorado and Michigan. We would never have thought ourselves 10 years ago to be between Michigan and Colorado politically. I think we're also close to Oregon. But you also look at here where Georgia and Texas are, where Missouri is, which used to be pretty much of a swing state, where Ohio is back to being, swing state, Pennsylvania swing state, Florida, these are, and Minnesota is probably one of the surprise states here too.
Yeah. I think Minnesota has trended a little bit more Republican, especially in the Trump era. But it's it's surprising that Virginia is more blue than Minnesota. And if you kind of look at it,
but that's the cultural shift that's occurring in this country, isn't it? I mean, you're talking about very different states now, whereas the old DFL in Minnesota used to rule the roost. You saw the results in 2016. That eastern part of Minnesota and what do they call it, the Iron Belt up there, shifting toward the blue collar Minnesota voter, the Democratic voter, now shifting a little bit possibly to Trump. And I don't know if the Minneapolis police situation with the police union and the problems they're going to possibly move Minnesota closer to the Trump column. I don't know.
We'll see. I mean, it has been interesting to watch kind of the blue collar move towards Trump and Republicans more generally, and then the college educated move more towards the left. Now, whether that is a short-term Trump effect or if that's going to be a more long-term realignment of the parties, we'll have to see, in a couple of years, whether it's, 2 or 4 or 6 or however long.
Okay. But that's a great chart there. That's the one that I sort of locked on when you sent it over to me earlier. It was like, where's Virginia now relative to, we're not, those aren't regional states that we're around politically, right? We're not talking North Carolina, Maryland, or Georgia, or South Carolina, Tennessee. That's just not who we are anymore. And
it's interesting. So Virginia is, D plus 12. Kansas is R plus 12. So if you think about, who is kind of our Republican counterpart to Virginia, it would be Kansas, which I think you would think is much more Republican than it is. And I think it's just the politics lately has been pushing more states into this middle ground.
Interesting. Very interesting. Look at Utah though. And I saw that Utah poll because Clinton only got like 27% there in 16.
They had a strong third party support there.
What's that?
They had strong third party support there.
Well, that was the Evan McMullen race, and I wrote about that last week. But Utah, if it's a toss up, I mean, I think Utah is going to break hard for Trump in the end. But Utah in play is it just shows you the changing nature of states these days, how dynamic things really are.
Yeah.
Okay. Super.
So it's important to put all this in context, right? Where is Trump now compared to where he was in 2016? So as of June 9th, 2016, Hillary was up by 4, an average of 3.2 to 3.8. So this is as both candidates were trying to consolidate their base after during tough primary processes for Clinton. Whereas on the right, Biden's leading now by 8. And again, this is nationwide. So I hate really looking at nationwide states when we're talking about an electoral college play. That's one of the mistakes that the Democrats often make.
Still though, let's he has fallen from 43.6 at the end of the day, last time to 41.7. I think he ended up at 46 nationally. And then, Clinton got up to 48, I think. And then the third party guys aren't as prominent this year. Evan McMullen and Jill Stein and those folks. So the fact that Clinton was only ahead by 4, I think showed that was more. I think people were still laughing Trump off in 2016 at this point because they're like, it's Donald Trump. He's never going to win, right? Now it's an 8-point gap. But let's be honest, I think Joe Biden is a weaker national candidate than Hillary Clinton for a number of reasons, but he doesn't draw the animosity that Hillary Clinton did.
I think
people aren't opposed to Joe Biden as much as they are Hillary Clinton, but they're also not that excited about him either.
I agree. It'll be interesting to see if the anti-Trump momentum is kind of overcomes the lack of excitement for Joe Biden himself. Looking at these two charts, I never want to try to predict Trump support long term. I think there's too many surprises. I think he can rebound better than I've seen rebound to a point where he's competitive and better than I've seen pretty much any politician do in a very long time.
Oh, absolutely. I think if we start seeing a steep upward trend on employment, if we see the economy and jobs coming back, and we see a move towards law and order, and we see a move towards China, I think he's going to have to strike out and campaign. I mean, you pollsters and modelers do what they do, and they're going to say, here's what you want to talk about, and here's how you want to talk about it, and here's who you want to talk about it to, and where they are. And that's how numbers move. And you get a couple bad gaps from Joe Biden, this thing's back in the margin of error. But right now, it's outside the margin of error.
It is. And also, if you look back at kind of the left-hand side of the Clinton-Trump graph here, there are touch points. There are points when the race was even, whereas you don't really see that so far in the Trump versus Biden chart.
That spike in the 2016, what was that? Do you remember what that was? We need to take a little dive on that. That looks like at the end of July, September.
I would bet that's when they first announced an investigation into her emails. I think he came out in the summer and said that they were investigating. And it's also at a point when Trump started to be able to consolidate Republican support.
Yeah, and that was also convention time. So, okay. All right. Great. 4 to 8.
So just, to your point about Biden, I think there's a lot there. I think the left really pounded away at a lot of issues in the primary about why he was not the best standard bearer for a party that has moved further to the left. And I think there's a lot of opposition research. We've talked, I'm a former opposition researcher, reformed opposition researcher, I guess. And, there's a lot there. And there's, over the course of a 30, 40 year public career, you're going to have cases where you voted one way in the 80s, another way in the 90s, and then flipped back. There's going to be a lot of flip-flops that Oppo can point to.
Well, let's talk about opposition research, because I think this is a critical part of the conversation that you and I are having, because you see Biden almost at 50, which is a danger for any challenger to see your opponent at 50. I mean, that's like, that you're pretty much, you're almost done at that point, in my estimation. Once you cross that 50 threshold, it's very harmful for your chances. And I don't care where it is in the cycle. When you're at 50, especially when you're coming into July, that's like, this is a problem especially when you're in the incumbent. But opposition research is only as good as the narrative that you have set up against your opponent. So it has to feed this narrative, and it has to, whatever the Trump team comes up with in opposition research, and I agree with you, I'm seeing more and more of it on social media, they're going to come at him with like, he's not that good of a guy. Mm-hmm. He's bad on racial issues. He has a number of gaffes in this area, a number of bad votes, and that's counter narrative to the narrative that the Biden people want to put out there. And that drives the whole turnout model. What are you seeing, or have you been in this realm at all on Biden in your polling and modeling?
So I think, just to kind of talk about what the narrative should be, you can run multiple narratives, especially in a national race like this. What we did a lot of, and I was with America Rising, the opposition research firm here in DC, against Clinton, was actually in the early part, we would run "she's not liberal enough" stories. We would push them out on our social media. We would try to get some stories placed in, the Huffington Posts of the world, and say she's not liberal enough, to try to decrease some momentum for her among her own base.
Right.
So that part will be there for Biden, especially as Black Lives Matter is, more of a more of a push, and it was already kind of creeping up in the conversation during the primary, his support for the crime bill in the 90s. Being able to kind of undercut,
that was his bill, wasn't it?
yeah, yep.
And that was the Biden crime bill. I mean, that's the way they're going to put it, right? They're going to put those social media posts and those stories and those ads on local radio. It was Joe Biden's bill that put people in jail.
Yep. And Anita Hill, and that's going to undercut him with some of the Democratic women.
Anita Hill.
Yep.
What's the Anita Hill angle?
Well, him just kind of shutting that down and helping get Thomas on the court. That's going to be an issue among Democratic women. Again, you saw it a little bit in the primary, and it's another way to kind of get at him from the left. Now from the right, we'll see if he's how far left he is pulled by this law and order perspective. We'll see if Obamacare comes back, if healthcare is as big of an issue in 2020 in the fall as it was in Virginia last year, or in 2018. It was a major issue, especially among independent voters. So kind of his legacy points, we'll be able to see if the opposition research resonates. And that's really where polling comes in. We can see how these messages resonate with certain people. And what the modeling allows you to do is kind of build on the polling and say, okay, polling said that the Obamacare hits only work with 10% of people, let's say.
Right.
So you wouldn't necessarily say, okay, that's what we should go up on all broadcast with. We should hit everyone with that message. But when you add in the modeling element, we can find who exactly those 10% of people are, and then you can target them with digital. You can target them with mail, phone calls, anything that you really do on an individual basis as far as voter contact methods. You can actually touch those people with the healthcare message that they want to hear that is going to move their votes. It's really allowing elections to be a little bit more personalized and really talk to voters about.
I think it's becoming far more a la carte. Because we're in this horrible binary choice realm of you get A or B, but you don't choose really A or B. You choose subset of A and subset of B and say, look, I'm going to vote for judges, or I'm going to vote against Benghazi, or I'm going to vote for this. I'm going to vote on China. I'm going to vote for Black Lives Matter. Whatever it is, the voter's not going, I'm voting for Joe Biden, I'm voting for Donald Trump. They say, I'm voting for this about them. I'll take that, because let's be honest, we have a very good lifestyle here in America. We've got it pretty good. We can justify to ourselves that we're going to vote a particular way for a particular reason and explain it to people. And give you an example. Over the weekend, I was with a group of friends, and we were talking about politics, which I never like to do because it's just, don't bring work home. But anyway, and this one solid Democrat voter who grew up in a very patriotic household in Western Pennsylvania, teacher, recently retired teacher. I mean, this is like the female core, what I would consider a core Democratic voter, said she voted for Donald Trump. And I was surprised. And I said, really, why did you do that? And she said, because of Benghazi. And that stunned me, that she voted for that one thing for Donald Trump, who she didn't even like because she hated Hillary Clinton. So she justified by saying, look, I voted against her because of Benghazi. So it was that negative partisanship, but on an issue. And that's what polling and modeling finds, are those slivers of those activating points.
Yeah.
And that's always fascinating me about politics, is finding out what really motivates people to do things, because what you see on TV is a part of that, but you never know. I don't know what motivates someone to do something, but when you talk to them, you're like, wow, it was about judges. It was about Benghazi. It was about, taxes. It can be about a specific issue, but that's what it is.
And it could even be about a local issue. I mean, especially when you're talking about, looking ahead to next year in Virginia, it's going to be a lot of very small local issues, and maybe so-and-so didn't fill a pothole fast enough. If, they're running for assembly or something like that, it's people make up their minds on very minute things, and it's not always the obvious thing.
And I think that especially the Republican Party here in Virginia, they've lost all sight of that. Their messaging is so, and we'll talk about that another time, but their messaging is so bad on some of these issues. People go, why are you worried about this? because you're just trying to win a nomination. We had one in VA5 this past weekend. They're trying to literally blow a congressional seat, but we'll come back to that some other time. Let's go to the next one. Sorry, I'm rambling this morning. You get a lot of sleep.
Yeah, you're good. So I guess kind of to the point of, Biden having some issues on his left, he said in, the end of the nominating process, the end of the nominating process, I guess, that he would appoint a woman because there was a real push from the women of the party, who's a large base for the Democratic Party, that there needed to be a woman on the ticket. And now you see that there is, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, a much more of a push for him to nominate a woman of color. So this isn't just among Democrats. This is from the New York Times, the support for the Black Lives Matter movement. Their headline is that it has increased almost as much in the last 2 weeks as it had in the preceding 2 years. So, in 2017, the beginning of 2018, most Americans did not support the Black Lives Matter movement. But starting in the beginning of 2018 through 2019, and even the beginning of this year, there was a steady increase in support for Black Lives Matter, which just has a huge spike here in the last couple of weeks. And now it's at a net plus 28. So while Republicans still, I think it's a net negative 39, so they don't support the Black Lives Matter movement, that's still only 39. It was, I think it was in the low 60s before the last 2 weeks. So there's been a huge jump. So
even Republicans are getting more on board with Black Lives Matter. When I looked up on Black Lives Matter, the website, and I think it's important for people to understand that there's this movement that has been branded, and then there's an organization. And I looked up what they believe. And I don't think a lot of people would support what they believe that goes beyond issues of race, because they get into issues of transgender, gender issues, gender identification, that I think are just out of the lane of what Black Lives, I think, instinctively means to a lot of voters. And is that a potential problem for that organization and the movement when they get out of that lane?
I think the concern is really in, if people are going to digest this in sound bites. So I think hearing the Black Lives Matter movement is going to be still positive. That message is positive. I don't think as many people are going to really dig into the back end of what they do as probably as we would like. But on the flip side, the defund the police movement is a slogan that supporters say does not fully match up what their intent is, which they say their intent is to heavily reform policing. But when your slogan is defund the police, that's what people are going to hear, and that's what they're going to react to. And frankly, that moved very quickly from Black Lives Matter to defund the police, which for independent voters specifically, and I've done a lot of work with independent women voters, that's going to be a disconnect that Republicans can kind of talk to. It's that, yes, we need reforms. Mitt Romney came out and said Black Lives Matter. Kind of depoliticize and support kind of the notion of equality, but defunding the police goes too far. And then we get into that law and order conversation, which frankly puts us back on more solid Republican territory. Because when we're talking about security issues, those independent voters tend to lean a little bit more right.
Okay. So, but when you start that conversation and to get those numbers down, I'm just talking about how politics works for the audience, and how these leads and popularity of certain things that flare up like this and on a political level, how you sort of mitigate the downside of that is you say, okay, but we can't defund the police. You start bending the curve, if you will, back down. And then in your subsets, can you go back in and see, does the transgender aspect or gender identification of the organization hurt turnout among Black Lives Matter movement supporters who are most, would that play into that? And again, it's opposition research and modeling that would say, yeah, but we don't want to go out and I'm not going to vote for that,
It could. I think it depends on how politically engaged and how much that individual voter kind of looks into, because if someone is really going to be for Black Lives Matter,
they're going to be for this no matter what.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. But again, it's
but
not about this particular issue. It's about how an issue can be deconstructed by the opponents on a partisan level, and especially when we're modeling turnout.
So to that end, I mean, that's when we tend to take, okay, the Black Lives Matter movement kind of spreads beyond that. And it's not necessarily talking more about the movement than the organization. The movement now has turned into defund the police, or a large segment has turned into a defund the police kind of message. And that is much easier to kind of pick apart. So that's kind of where I would see that the messaging goes, where I think that the opposition research is going to flow. And then the modeling will kind of pull those, going back to the security moms, that's who that message is really not going to play with. But to also kind of put this in perspective, this spike that we see here on the slide, it's similar to what we see in support for gun control after a major incident. You know, after the Stoneman Douglas shooting, there was a huge spike, or Sandy Hook, there's a huge spike in support for gun control. And then that fell pretty quickly. It kind of reverted back to kind of a stable line. What's interesting here, which makes me think that this might be a little bit more long lasting, is that there has been steady increase in support over the last couple of years, that this isn't just a flat line, a spike, and then it'll go back to a flat line.
Right.
We're seeing kind of like a general upward trend. So
yeah, this is a great chart, and it helps people, I think, when they're looking at this a little bit differently, especially for Republicans in a general election. I mean, I think there's a way to balance the messaging for Republicans going into this one. If you take a look at Larry Hogan, you can pretty much, you know, that guy's a smart politician. Where would he line up on this when he's in Baltimore? I mean, he's going to be full square for it, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Now, you know, putting myself on the other side, if I was a Democrat, if I was Joe Biden, I would probably be doing what he's doing, which is, you know, he put out his short list, or they're talking about his short list for VP. And so there are 6 women on it. One is Elizabeth Warren, who I think had to be on it at this point. And I think if you were talking a couple months ago, she would have been the prohibitive favorite. And then Michelle Grisham, who's the Latina governor of New Mexico, is also on there. And then the other 4 are African-American Black women. You've got Kamala Harris and Val Demings, who's a congresswoman out of Florida, who I think are really interesting choices because they both are African-American women, but have a background in law and order. Harris was a prosecutor, and then Demings was a police chief.
Right.
So
is that a problem?
For Harris, it was in the primary. You know, but the calculus is a little bit different now. So now I think the left is looking for, you know, I'm not exactly an expert in Democratic politics, but from the outside, it looks that Democrats are looking for kind of an identity, not symbol, and I don't want to say token because I do think it's more important than that. But they're looking for representation on the national ticket. But they also understand, or they should understand, that someone with more of that law and order background, someone who has been kind of on the police or on the legal side of these issues, is going to reassure independent voters that Biden just didn't put a radical person on his ticket that could take over with all of his issues that we're seeing elsewhere. So it's going
to be hard for them to say, you know, because when I was looking at this, the nomination run up, I mean, I was talking to Black male voters, and they were saying Kamala's a cop. They just referred to her as she's a cop. And then Val Demings was an actual cop. Mm-hmm. That's going to be a difficult sell, I think, or a more difficult sell versus, say, someone like Susan Rice, who can come in and be national security advisor, you know, to President Obama, bring the team together. I think I think she's got the inside track.
I think that brings a lot of baggage also, though, from the Obama era and from, you know, was the kind of theories in the Trump circles that they were, you know, kind of undercutting his campaign in 2016. But I think the other interesting one is Mayor Bottoms in Atlanta, that she's also on the list. Yeah. So
here's the problem with a lot of these folks, though. I mean, especially the mayor of Atlanta, no real governing experience at the national level. When Joe Biden and I'm going to be generous here, has had bad moments.
Yeah.
Has had senior moments that make you go, I don't think I really want him to be in charge of this thing. And that's obviously going to be a talking point, a campaign theme for the Republicans when they go after Joe Biden. It's like the guy's just not all there. And it's easy to make that case.
Yes. I do think that'll be easy for that case to be made. So that is the downside to a Bottoms or even a Demings kind of appointment.
Right.
But it's also on Rice. Like you said, she has the national security advisor side of things, but she hasn't actually run anything. So that
they're going to be open, but basically there's a weakness in all of them. There's a weakness in every single one of them. That's a tough one to get after. Do they come back and do a Cory Booker?
I don't know. I don't think that he can walk back his pledge to put a woman on there. I think he's kind of boxed himself into a corner as far as who this list needs to be, because he did promise that. And I think, again, you're going to wind up, if he goes with a guy, even a Cory Booker, it's going to look like already breaking a promise to the left. And then what is that going to mean, given his lack of, let's say, progressive.
He's in enough hot water as it is.
Exactly. He doesn't need to kind of turn his back on those promises.
All right, let's jump to women candidates now.
Yeah. So this is some good news for the right. There are more Republican women running for federal office now than ever before. We saw.
Well, that's not saying that much, but it's a trend, right?
It's a trend, and it's a pretty big jump.
Are we looking on the left here, on the right?
We're looking on the right. Sorry,
okay.
I should have rearranged the slide.
No, that's fine. But you see the sharp increase there.
Yep. And so it's, a similar kind of trajectory as what Democrats saw in 2018, which was, the year of the woman, but it was really the year of the Democratic woman. We're just seeing over 200 Republican women running this is just for U.S. House, much less state.
That's nationwide. Over 200 women ran for Congress this year.
Yep.
Higher than the Democrats in 2016, but the Democrats really cranked it up. So obviously the going after the women's vote is critical, and the Republicans are playing the game too.
They're playing the game, and I think there's a couple of things that I think point to why this increase has happened. I think the party structure has been a little bit more focused on recruiting women candidates, but there's a phrase that I like to use is that women are risk aware. They are not necessarily risk adverse. So when women candidates are kind of thinking about, or when women are thinking about becoming candidates, they will really look at the landscape, see if they have the possibility to win, but that they know that is always going to be a risk.
Sure.
What they're really looking for is the support going to be there on the other side of, like, once I file my nomination papers, is there going to be support? Is there going to be fundraising support? Is there going to be kind of outside support? Is there all of these kind of mechanisms? And you can see kind of, if you look back in 1990 to 1992, there was a big jump in Democratic women. And that was the onset of Emily's List. And when Emily's List really started getting around and their reputation increased. So Democratic women saw that there was a structure within the party to support them. And I think after 2018, the group that I was formerly with, Winning for Women, on the federal side, and then also Elise Stefanik, especially, and her leadership pack, she's a congresswoman from New York, stepping up to say, hey, you should run, we're going to be here for you, really helped encourage some Republican women to jump into the ring.
I think Democrats, at least anecdotally from what I've heard and what they've told me, that they will vote for a woman over a man because she's a woman. More so, I say more so than Republicans would vote for a woman versus a man. Did we see that in any polling or model? That's just my gut instinct. As far as a deciding factor, I think Democrats will make that shift. I mean, look, in Virginia, they recruited women for the House in 2018. They, Jennifer Waxton, Abigail Spanberger, Elaine Luria, they went after women and basically said, we're running women. Yep. And the party got behind them and said, guys, get the hell out of the way. We're putting women on the ticket, and we're going to vote for women because Trump is so unpopular with women.
And I think the Republican Party is in that we're going to recruit women, but we're not quite in that space where we're going to push men out of the way. I don't think we like to
see that's a big thing for, because more women, more men are Republican vote. more male Republican voters identify with being male and going, I'm not going to vote for someone just because she's a woman. I'm
They're
going to
not
vote
going to do
for.
that. But you also have to remember that what Republicans vote on, especially Republican primary voters vote on, are a very different set of issues. And you have a different set of, let's say, stereotypes that kind of come into play. Whereas Democrats really look to social issues when they're in their primaries. That tends to play more in positively with the stereotypes that plague women candidates. On the Republican side, our primaries often, and especially recently, focus on security issues, where Republicans want candidates who are strong, and I mean that in kind of a lot of different ways. They want to see someone with mental and physical strength, which is counter to a lot of the stereotypes that they have of women candidates. And it's not just of women generally, but it's also, when you look at the media landscape, most of the women in office are Democrats. So there's kind of that disconnect. So women candidates, I'm working with a bunch of them on the federal side this year. If they're going through primaries, I really kind of stress to them that you have to focus on showing grit, showing your ability to get things done, because Republican primary voters, that's what they're looking for. And when you're just kind of shown a blank male face and a blank female face, they're going to kind of think that the man is going to be stronger on these issues. And it has very little to do with the candidates themselves, and it's more about
we're seeing that here in Virginia with a state senator who's running for governor next year, and she's basically calling out the men, saying that, I mean, she's literally posted on Facebook, why don't you grow a pair? She's trying to be the uber tough female in the crowd by basically calling out the manhood of frankly her colleagues in the state Senate by saying they don't want a strong independent woman, they're just weak males and this kind of thing. It's been an interesting dynamic, and I think to your point, that's what she's playing into. I won't mention her name because I don't want to give her any street cred.
I think that's probably true. I don't know if it works when it's a personal attack. I tend to think that kind of backfires on candidates, especially in the early stages of a primary. But if you're looking at kind of the ad that Joni Ernst played in her first run, where she was going to make them squeal, and she played into the whole like pig farmer aspect of her bio, that showed her as tough, and it helped her get through that primary.
All right, let's get into COVID.
Yeah.
COVID. Let's go COVID. Ooh.
So, just to kind of transition from what we've been talking about, how is it going to affect elections? And this map that we're looking at is just of mail ballots for the Republican Senate primary. So this is only Republicans, which is why you see certain parts of the state as fairly light compared to others. But we're seeing spots around the state where 12 times more mail ballots are being sent in than in 2018. Wow. We're seeing a huge uptick. And frankly, we saw this in Georgia as well. A lot of people, so in Georgia, they got mailed absentee ballot request forms, everyone in the state. So then they had to fill it out, and then they would get a ballot, and then they can mail it in. So there's a multi-step process. Some states are just mailing ballots to everybody. But I don't think Virginia is considering that. So, but removing some of the barriers to voting by mail, there's a huge surge of mail ballot requests in Georgia. But what was interesting is that the state also vastly overestimated vote by mail participation and therefore underestimated how many people they were going to need at the polls on election day. Digging through some of the data that we've seen, it's not that people are transitioning from voting on election day to voting by mail, though there is some of that, especially among older voters. Not really wanting to go to the polling place with all these other people if they're in kind of those high risk categories. What we're seeing is that people who are typically general election voters but don't vote in primaries are now voting in primaries because it's easier. We're seeing some people who've never voted now voting in primaries because it's easier, but the biggest chunk is really from those voters who are used to voting in some way, shape, or form and are just now voting on primaries because it's a little bit easier.
Yeah, and one of the problems we have that in Virginia, especially with the Republican Party here, is they keep holding these moronic conventions and losing all the data and Republican voters and trying to nominate the basically the worst general election candidate they can find. You know, the more editorializing I can do here, the better. But how does this translate in I guess in the last election in Georgia? Did you see a translation to an event or a switch, a change in general election outcomes?
Well, we don't really know yet.
So you haven't had any data of the general election for Georgia. This is based on their
No. I'm
primaries
just
too?
talking about the Georgia primary election from last week.
Okay.
So there was that push towards mail-in ballots, and the in-person. I mean, it's kind of the polling that we did in the Republican circles. It's kind of what you would expect. Like I said, older voters were more likely to say that they were going to vote by mail, and younger and especially male voters were saying, no, I'm still going to show up on election day.
So this is a trend we'll keep an eye on.
Exactly.
What about going to school?
So this has been fun. We at WPA ran a series of models back in April. So how we do models is we do a large scale kind of survey. So we survey tens of thousands of people nationwide, ask them a very short series of questions, and collect the observations, which then we match back to hundreds of data points that we have, like that scary big data term. That's kind of what we use. And then for these, we also use data on a county level of where COVID was striking. So data from Johns Hopkins specifically. So, and then our data scientists went through and found the patterns of who on an individual level is more likely to behave a certain way. So for this, what we're looking at here, who is more likely to send their kids back to school immediately upon being able to. And what we can see here is that Virginia is more ready to send their kids back to school than some of their neighbors. 25% of Virginians want to send their kids back to school immediately. The difference is in West Virginia, 51% were ready to send their kids back to school right away.
That's pretty funny. That's an interesting perspective. Like why? But we'll figure that out later. So
well,
Virginia,
not as hard hit.
Right.
Not as hard hit as Virginia and some of these other states.
And they're more socially distant. Are we finding that more in rural areas?
We are. I mean, I think we saw that even with some of the protests to
sure.
the state. They were coming from a lot of the more rural areas.
Okay, so is this an overperformance when you look at the statewide to rural desires to get their kids because they're more socially distant anyway?
I think so. I think there's a lot of kind of ideological opinions that go back there too. And again, if they're not as hard hit, there's not. You can see it on the right with the weight category. New York kind of stands out as one of the states where more people are going to wait to send their kids back to school. They were particularly hard hit, and they're just going to kind of hold off and make sure that everything is safe.
It's interesting. It's interesting how the split there goes. If you just follow New York and Virginia, 25-23, 31-23, and then 8. There's just a big drop off there. It's a change in dynamics there.
We also have a segment of people who are never going to send their kids back to school, which I don't fully,
really.
They're going to have to be very much more confident in how schools are going to kind of clean and keep their kids safe. But we'll see if that's it is truly a forever kind of never sending my kids back to school.
It's a very interesting look because it doesn't take much to throw some elections based on that. Look at the DeSantis race in Florida and how school choice impacted that one there.
Yeah.
Let's do consumers. Consumers are stabilizing.
Yeah, they are, thankfully. So this data is from Morning Consult. It's consumer confidence numbers. So anything over 100 is good. Below 100 is a little bit more pessimistic. These numbers come out on the 1st of the month. So you can really see, so January is January 1st data. So January, February, March, Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, the whole region is fairly optimistic about the way the economy is for them personally and more generally. And then we see the sharp decline in April and May. But the data that came out on June 1st is stable and actually even a little bit of an uptick.
Yeah.
Which is positive. And it corresponds with what we saw with the unemployment numbers everyone was pleasantly surprised by, that unemployment didn't go that much higher when that data came out in June. So we'll see if this is
What's one of the more interesting things, if you juxtapose this with the Northam and Hogan numbers, Virginians are more confident about the economy, and the consumers are. But Hogan still way outperforms Ralph Northam despite of that. So it is, a personality thing there, isn't it?
It's personality, or it could be other issues. I mean,
Still though, I mean, like if your economy's better, and that guy's 15 points ahead of you in the polls in his home state, and they're down. It's just observing Maryland, Virginia numbers here, and just trying to draw some parallel. Of course, there may not be any, so let's just keep moving it along then.
All right.
Let's travel. The travel numbers were very interesting for me.
Yeah. So these are the same models that we're talking about for school. It's the same kind of methodology. So this one is who is going to be looking to travel and specifically stay at a hotel soon within a pandemic, after the pandemic's over, or versus those who are going to wait. So do want to stress, like, this is the stay in a hotel kind of method. I know anecdotally, I'm from New York. There are more people that are willing to kind of travel to other families' houses, but not necessarily stay in a hotel. So this is kind of I'm staying somewhere that is not necessarily as controlled as I know it will be. And 29% of Virginians want to travel soon. They're going to stay at a hotel soon after the pandemic's over, which is similar to a lot of these other southern states. It's actually higher than in South Carolina or in Florida.
Yeah, that was interesting how Virginians really want to get away. They feel like in the same way if you look at that in the school, I mean, I think when the governor came out and said, we're shut down to June 10th, everyone's like, June 10th, that's 3 months, but if you look at New Yorkers, they're not going anywhere.
No. And same thing in New Jersey. They know that they're kind of hunkered down for a while. And again, I think that says a lot to do with.
They were impacted heavily, though.
Yeah. So.
But look at West Virginia, 6%, same as New York. That's so interesting.
And that also might be an economic issue. So there's a lot of different things that come into play here. But the way that we kind of talk to clients and potential clients about how to use like this data specifically, if you're a hotel and you're trying to market to people, the soon group, whoever falls into this is the people that you're going to want to send your promotions to, like, hey, my hotel is awesome, don't you want to get away? Like that's who you can kind of target of like, they're going to be traveling again, kind of like normal fairly soon. This wait segment, you need to really stress what you're doing to keep people safe, how you're cleaning your rooms. I saw some hotels are keeping like rooms clean and then unoccupied for 48 hours to kind of just let things settle. So for this wait group, that's who the hotel should be talking to about all of the measures that they're putting into place. Whereas the soon, or those are the people that you can start sending immediate promotions to. And again, because these are models, we can do that on an individual.
And you do this for private clients too. I mean, there is not just political folks. You do this for a lot of corporate clients. Okay, great. Well, Amanda Iovino, thank you for joining us here, Virginia Free TV. Whoop, whoop. Putting the YouTube channel here. We're trying to tack into the wind that's blowing this on the Zoom and doing some more virtual stuff. Give me 3 quick takeaways, and then we'll have the one question we had at the beginning.
So I think takeaway on the COVID, people want to return to normal. I think people are looking to get back to their daily lives fairly quickly, but they're not going to be kind of too rash about it. So when it comes to voting specifically on COVID, I think that we're going to have higher participation than ever if some of these mail-in ballots, these reforms kind of take place through November. I know a lot of states push them for their primaries, but if this happens again for November, we're going to be looking at record turnout again. And then on the political side of things, I think you really want to look at, just to be timely, the Black Lives Matter movement. I think we saw a spike in support for it, but that spike, like we talked about earlier, is going to be more long lasting than a lot of the other spikes that we see, because the momentum had been there for the movement over the last couple of years.
Right. Okay. To that end, is there an opportunity? I'm going to try to meld that question that came from one of our participants. Is there an opportunity for Republicans to go after African-American voters where they have not been that successful, to tack into the Black Lives Matter and say, yeah, let's do this, but how well have you been served by the current incumbent? And look at his record on the crime bill and all those other statements that, frankly, Kamala Harris made punching bag out of back last summer.
Yeah, I think we talked about Larry Hogan before. I think he is a model for how Republicans can start making outreach into that community. Not start, continue and increase the level of outreach that we can talk to that community. We have to. I think it's long-term better for the party and for the country if we continue to make that outreach. But I would really look at kind of what Hogan was doing. And as we talked about before, it's first going there and having those conversations, and then following through on those conversations after they're done. I think that's a big first step for us.
Okay, well, the Republicans have their work cut out for them, as they usually do. They try to make it as difficult as possible for them. Virginia Free remains steadfastly, staunchly, proudly nonpartisan and independent in the realm of politics. And that's one of the great blessings in life, is not to be able to. We can point fingers at both sides. God knows they both need it. But Amanda, I really appreciate you joining us today, and I hope you'll come back on and update us on more polling and more modeling as it goes throughout the summer. It's going to be an exciting year in 2020, but we're going into a gubernatorial cycle here in Virginia, and I know that's going to be of interest to a lot of folks as well. So we'll hopefully have you back on here in a regular, maybe have you on a regular basis here once we find the right time to fit into the schedule, because we're all working out of our homes. So it's exciting. So we'll get this cut and clipped over to YouTube, and we'll push it out from there. But thanks for joining us, Amanda Iovino with WPA Intel. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.